Welcome to the All of Christ for All of Life podcast, where we equip men and women to be faithful in every aspect of life. This week, you will hear the opening sections of Douglas Wilson's Rules for Reformers, read by Toby Sumter.
Introduction. A generation ago, community organizer Saul Alinsky famously penned his Rules for Radicals, and it is my conviction that those interested in Reformation should match his craft and self-awareness without trying to compete at all with the speed and depth of his revolutionary destructo vision. And, incidentally, if you're interested in the grace of God transforming individuals, families, neighborhoods, churches, communities, cities, cultures, nations, and the world, then you're interested in Reformation. Some revolutionaries are patient, and some are not. Gramsci argued for the long march through the institutions, and Lenin wanted the massive meltdown all at once. Most revolutionaries have what Billingsley described as a fire in the minds of men, but some are willing to go for the slow burn. More than just simple patience is required to distinguish a revolutionary from a reformer. So, what are the basic rules for reformers? 1. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Reformation of culture is either a species of salvation or sanctification, and you can't have either one of those without Jesus. Secular conservatism will sometimes buy you some time, but that is about all it can do. That and lure you into the complacent notion that it can do more than that. Secular conservatism is like trying to use your pocket handkerchief to slow you down after the main chute has failed. This is why individual heart transformation, not legislation, is fundamental to national reformation. The person and work of Jesus is not optional. 2. Always remember the distinction between principles and methods. Say that the principle is to win the war against the enemy. The methods would be Navy, artillery, Air Force, ground troops, etc. Someone enamored of method would think that the war can be won by their branch of the service alone, without any help from the others. Those who latch onto the methods being employed, without any awareness of the principles being served, are either simple-minded or partisans. The simple need leadership. They can make great foot soldiers, but don't ever make them generals. The partisans need a peculiar kind of leadership. But you have to be careful. They're the ones who are already a tad too gung-ho about your leadership, and they think you are as gummed up about particular methods as they are. 3. Reformers are conservatives, which means they must prefer the concrete to the abstract. The past is concrete, just like the future is going to be. The goal is to preserve and defend everything the Spirit has done in history in such a way as to carry it forward into what the Spirit is going to do. Given our time-bound nature, we must conserve some things, and we must progress toward certain things. But what do we conserve, and what do we seek to build? Our duties are always in the present, but we must read the past as well as the future, albeit more dimly, and we must do so by the performance of concrete duties. Love your neighbor, not mankind. Build an actual school for your children, and do not love the notion of educational great concepts in some Euclidean eschaton. 4. Reformers must cultivate a high sense of humor. Reformation involves conflict, as we shall see in a moment, but how you fight makes all the difference. Should you fight like a cavalier, with swift swordplay and witticisms, or like a thug with a club and a wart on your nose? The besetting sin of ostensible reformers is the sin of shrillness and officious forms of uplift. We need reformers, not another round of bossy pantses. We also need someone who knows how to form the plural of bossy pants. 5. Reformers must be combative. Christians are often uncomfortable with the language of conflict, but being neutral is not an option. He that is not with me is against me, and he that gathers not with me scatters abroad, says Jesus. Matthew 12:30. There is no way to do any of this without involving yourself in the rough stuff. This means that courage is required. The adversary fights back, and they know how to fight back. Not only that, but because this is a battle between good and evil, and you are fighting for the good, right? The other side gets to cheat, and you don't get to. You have to fight, and you have to fight clean, and you have to fight fair. When you enlist in the army, you cannot feign surprise when you find yourself in battles. 6. Reformers must play the long game. We are not laboring for a convenience store reformation, where you buy and consume your item before you pull out into traffic, depending on how troublesome the shrink wrap is. If we have Christ, we have all things future, and so we can leave the outcome of our present labors to Him. We don't have to see the larger end to perform our part in that larger end, and our part is now. 7. Reformers must remember always that religion shapes culture, and culture trumps politics. The plug-in ought not to go straight from reformation in the church to legislation. Legislative battles are important in the meantime, but mostly as a defensive measure. The offense won't happen until we make the connection between our faith and culture, the kind of culture that forms apart from laws. Just as you can't fight a naval war without ships, or tank warfare without tanks, you can't fight a culture war without a culture. The reformation of the church must occur so that there is a reformation of our subculture, and then our subculture will affect the larger polis. Expecting our faith to affect the larger polis, when it has not yet changed the average shelf at the local Christian bookstore, is expecting something that is not going to happen. With the weird exception of baseball, where the ball is handled entirely by the defense, you can't score points until you have the ball. And reformers will not have the ball until they have a culture. That'll do for the present. A tip of the hat to Saul Alinsky. In some respects, this book has been an homage to Saul Alinsky, and in other respects, it is an answer. Alinsky was a man of the left, as I am not, and he did not believe in God, as I most heartily do. But his influence was remarkable. He was the father of community organizing in Chicago, where a young Barack Obama followed in his footsteps a generation later. A young Hillary Clinton did her senior honors thesis at Wellesley College on Alinsky. He was an ungodly man, but he was ungodly the same way King David's commanding general Joab was. Joab was a thoroughgoing man of the world, out for number one, but he was extremely shrewd, and he often saw the world more accurately than others who ought to have known better. David was a man after God's own heart, but there were times when Joab would come in and school him properly. When it came to the question of whether to conduct a census of Israel and Judah, Joab was right and David was wrong. 2 Samuel 24, 1-4. When it came to David's behavior after the death of Absalom, Joab was right and David was wrong. 2 Samuel 19:5. So it is necessary to learn from Alinsky, but it is also necessary to remember that as we learn, we must make the necessary adjustments. Some things we must not learn from Joab. This book is part of an attempt to help us understand how to make the necessary distinctions. Alinsky was confronted with young radicals who had no illusions about the system, but plenty of illusions about the way to change the world. Rules for Radicals, page 13. How many Christians are in the same position? Ditch the illusions. A cultural reformation is no place for daydreaming. Reflecting on a Christian heritage by itself is worthless. A Christian heritage cannot be kept in a box. Power is not static. It cannot be frozen and preserved like food. It must grow or die. Rules for Radicals, page 149. Alinsky knew that culture precedes politics. Revolution must be preceded by reformation. To assume that a political revolution can survive without the supporting base of a popular reformation is to ask for the impossible in politics. Rules for Radicals, page 21. Change means movement. Movement means friction. Rules for Radicals, page 21. This means that reformers should expect resistance and conflict. A reformer does not walk onto the stage to polite applause. The job of the organizer is to maneuver and bait the establishment so that it will publicly attack him as a dangerous enemy. Rules for Radicals, page 100. When you are attacked by the powers that be, this is not a sign that something has gone dangerously wrong. There is no distinction to be made between working for reformation and picking a fight. When those prominent in the status quo turn and label you an agitator, they are completely correct, for that is, in one word, your function: to agitate to the point of conflict. Rules for Radicals, page 117. This is a prerequisite to another key truth. No one can negotiate without the power to compel negotiation. Rules for Radicals, page 119. While Alinsky had no clue about the ground and foundation of humor, he thought humor and absolute truth to be inconsistent, he nevertheless knew all about its tactical value. Humor is essential to a successful tactician, for the most potent weapons known to mankind are satire and ridicule. Rules for Radicals, page 75. Then there was his version of the KISS principle: keep it simple, stupid. Issues must be able to be communicated. It is essential that they can be communicated. It is essential that they be simple enough to be grasped as rallying or battle cries. Rules for Radicals, page 96. National Review illustrated this nicely years ago with a fine joke and terrible rallying cry, when they settled on a t-shirt slogan: "Don't let them immanentize the eschaton." Alinsky outlines 13 basic rules of power tactics. I will simply list them here and conclude with a brief comment that contextualizes it all for us. 1. Power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. 2. Never go outside the experience of your people. 3. Whenever possible, go outside the experience of the enemy. 4. Make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. 5. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. 6. A good tactic is one that your people enjoy. Also, organizations need action as an individual needs oxygen. People hunger for drama and adventure. Rules for Radicals, page 120. 7. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. 8. Keep the pressure on. 9. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. 10. The major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. 11. If you push a negative hard and deep enough, it will break through into its counterside. 12. The price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. 13. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Here's looking at you, Michael Moore. Saul Alinsky was an ethical relativist, and so he was willing to resort to the ear-biting and eye-gouging right away. In a fight, almost anything goes. It almost reaches the point where you stop to apologize if a chance blow lands above the belt. Rules for Radicals, pages 129 and 130. We are not in that unconstrained position, nor do we want to be. But answering to God, remembering the limits placed on us by Scripture, look over that list again. There is no principle there that we cannot use, and use more shrewdly and potently than a lost soul like Alinsky ever could. With this in mind, the following section of this book presents 10 principles of war we reformers must master if we want to stop the other team from continually running circles around us. Section 1. Principles first. Principles that govern every form of conflict are constant in all possible scenarios. The need for mobility, surprise, etc. will never fade away. But weapons and tactics are not constant. Rocks, bows, guns, triremes, torpedoes, etc. vary from era to era, and war to war. Electronic countermeasures played no role whatever in the Battle of Lepanto. Those who are merely competent in the use of a particular weapon are followers. They may be very competent indeed, but that is not the issue. They are also essential to the success of any campaign. But if they are promoted to the level where principled strategic thinking is necessary, they will also be essential to the failure of that campaign. Those who comprehend the principles involved are effective leaders. I would go so far as to say that this is one of the fundamental characteristics of effective leadership. Who is competent to see the dividing line between leaders and would-be leaders? Both kinds of people think they are leaders, but only one truly knows. In an egalitarian culture, however, true leadership is despised, and precedence is frequently given to technicians, bureaucrats, and various kinds of intellectual ground-pounders. This means that things can get fearfully skewed. We have generals who do not see the principles involved, and sergeants who do. The distinction between principles and methods is an objective one. However, to the one who is not gifted enough to see the distinction, the whole thing will appear to be a Zen exercise. When the distinctions are observed, the result is military wisdom. But principles do not fight by themselves. Principles are always incarnate in a particular method. There is therefore always something there to distract and confuse somebody who isn't thinking. This section provides an overview of the principles of war. They were developed on the field of battle, but they apply to any situation where conflict or competition is occurring. Reformers are concerned to win what have come to be called the culture wars, and unless we recover an understanding of these principles and learn to apply them to the conflicts we are in, then such a win will be impossible. The principles of war are 1. Objective 2. Offensive 3. Concentration 4. Mobility 5. Security 6. Surprise 7. Cooperation 8. Communication 9. Economy of force 10. Pursuit. I first learned these principles from a book my father wrote entitled Principles of War. I commend that book highly, even though the emphasis there is different. In Principles of War, these principles are applied to thinking strategically about evangelism. Here, our concern is the task of cultural reformation, which is of course related to evangelism, but not identical with it. But principles being what they are, remember that they apply whenever there is any kind of conflict or competition. These principles can be brought to bear in a shooting war, in a business competition, in political campaigns, in cultural politics, in a football game, and in evangelism. They can also be neglected in any of these realms. Because they are principles that have to be enfleshed in a particular method, they also have the prospect of the bad guys following these principles and the good guys neglecting them. Principles do not apply themselves. They must be studied, understood, grasped, and applied. The world being the messy kind of place that it is also possible for someone to apply the right principle at the wrong time. The only difference between salad and garbage, the wise man once said, is timing. A man might pursue when he shouldn't pursue. A man might launch a surprise attack at a boneheaded time, and succeed in the surprise part, but fail in the attack part. A man might be really mobile in unproductive ways, as when Jeb Stuart rode around the Battle of Gettysburg. This means it is not enough to say that the second principle is to maintain the offensive, point to what you are doing as being offensive, and assume that the discussion is over. Everything has its time and place, including these principles. It is not for nothing that Sun Tzu's book was called The Art of War. The necessary artistry is never found by applying principles in a clunkety way. So failure to attend to these principles is deadly. Failure to apply them in wisdom is also deadly. And assuming that they will take care of themselves if only you have abundant resources is perhaps the deadliest of all. For the rest of this first section of Rules for Reformers, I'll be giving some commentary on each of the 10 principles of war, looking to show how they apply to the cultural struggle we are in. But before we get into that specific commentary, I'll begin with a discussion of the decisive point, because it is key to understanding the first principle, establishing the objective. The decisive point. One of the first things a reformer has got to get used to is the experience of being despised and unpopular. Societies do awful things, that which needs to be reformed, because they want to, and the reformer is the one beckoning them to a state of affairs that they don't much want. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many, so as to pervert justice, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. Exodus 23, 2 and 3. Notice what this passage requires of us. There are times when the doing of evil is popular. Many want to do evil, and they summon you to join them. There are other times when you are being pressured to bear false witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many in order to pervert justice. And if you didn't trip over the next verse, you weren't paying attention. It prohibits every form of affirmative action, along with all its ugly cousins. The man of integrity decides according to the law and not according to whether the plaintiff has had a hard life. A reformer has to be the kind of man who can stand up to the clamor of the mob. This is the vertebrate mentality exhibited by Athanasius when he was informed that the world was against him. Well then, he replied, let it be known that Athanasius is contra mundum, against the world. A true reformer gives the PR department fits. The reformer marches to a different drummer, to not coin a phrase, but when he does this, he elicits real hatred. There are two kinds of nonconformity, and only one of them wears hipster glasses. The kind that does wear them is a very popular form of pretending to be out of the mainstream in order to be the envy of it, and the other is a radical form of unpopularity, calculated to get you slandered and viciously attacked on the way to changing the direction of the mainstream. One kind of nonconformity requires courage, while the other kind requires nothing more than vanity and a $5 cup of fair trade coffee. The reformer will be attacked by the establishment in the name of a previous generation of reformers. The men who killed the prophets have descendants, and those descendants identify themselves by building memorials to the prophets. Matthew 23, 29 through 31. The men who lionize the prophets, Jesus teaches, are the kind of men who would have tied them to the nearest stake themselves, and the men who are charged with attacking the legacy of the prophets are the true sons of the prophets. In short, the reformer cannot expect anything worthwhile to happen if all he hears is polite golf applause floating toward him from the establishment. Jesus teaches us to expect slander, to expect misrepresentation. Further, he teaches us to believe that when this happens, it is a sign that we are gaining on it. In Luke 6, 22 and 23, Jesus tells us to rejoice and leap for joy when we are reviled, excluded, shunned, and held in contempt. In Lattimore's translation of that passage, Jesus tells us that we are to frolic when this happens. We are able to do this, Jesus teaches, because we know the outcome of the story. We have the big picture. We know that great is our reward in heaven. But being heavenly minded is not an opiate. Being heavenly minded brings real earthly perspective. Conservative activists who are surprised or indignant at the gross lopsidedness of the whole system are being foolish because they are expecting the devil to be a gentleman. They are expecting him to fight clean and to avoid every form of fighting dirty. What makes us think he might do that? It would be tedious to go through all the available examples of this kind of thing. Just one should suffice. Occupy demonstrations are closely associated with vandalism, drugs, sexual assaults, riots, and such, while Tea Party demonstrations are closely associated with middle-aged people in funny hats who pick up after themselves. Which one is the screaming threat to our common weal? Right. The only thing that is missing in this farce is our ability to see how funny it is, and how much God doesn't care that they are cheating. In a battle of accusations and counter-accusations, they will always have the advantage. Let them have it. Devils make better accusers, always, and we are not in this to create right-wing devils. No, we have a better game to play than that. I said a moment ago that those who are heavenly minded have a clearly earthly perspective. They keep their heads. They are not thrown off by trash talk. or the mainstream media's inability to report on the trash talk. When they cheat and we get angry, this is nothing less than us enabling their cheating to work, to have its intended effect. The appropriate response is for them to cheat and for us to grin. So if we keep our heads, we are still engaged in the conflict, and we are engaged in it because it matters deeply to us. But it does not matter deeply to our ego, which means that we are in a position to think while we fight. This means that while we look at the terrain and think about what is at stake, we can settle on what is the decisive point. A decisive point is a place that is significant enough to matter to the enemy if you successfully take it, and insignificant enough to actually take. This means that the selected target is both strategic and feasible. Thinking nationally, in our culture wars, New York City is strategic but not feasible. Moose Breath, Idaho is feasible but not strategic. We could take Moose Breath for Jesus in about 3 weeks, but when we had, it wouldn't matter all that much. The reason our ministries are located here in the Palouse is that there are 2 major universities located in these 2 small towns, 8 miles apart. Pullman, Washington is the home of Washington State, and Moscow is the home of University of Idaho. The small towns make it feasible, and the universities make them strategic. To identify and go after a decisive point is the way to have a disproportionate impact. The example given above concerning New York City was not meant to discourage Christians from ministering there. Of course, many of us should be there. But when we are there, we should know that within a place like New York, there are numerous decisive points within the city. With a nation before us, one of the decisive points we have selected is the small town with the big university. With the city before us, there will be the same kind of decisive point available, but we won't see them if we are not aware of the concept and if we are not thinking about it. We don't have infinite resources at our disposal. We do serve an infinite God, but He loves to supply our needs on a day-to-day basis. That keeps us trusting Him. That means we must be the stewards of the resources He has already given, and this means we have to be selective. We have a limited number of troops, and so we have to decide where to put them. Joab was not a very good man, but he was a good general, and he divided his troops wisely for the battle. 2 Samuel 10:10-12. To return to the earlier point, understanding the decisive point helps us understand what our objective actually is. If our goal is to advance the kingdom, then we will be able to think clearly as we meditate on what will actually help to accomplish that. If our goal is personal fame and glory, then we will fail in one of 2 ways. First, we will be easily distracted when the enemy slanders us and lies about us. Because our goal is personal glory, we will react violently and unproductively when that is threatened or besmirched. The other thing that might happen is that we pick a little nothing objective and capture it with a lot of fanfare, followed by a big award ceremony. We don't want culture warriors who can be lured by the trappings of victory without any actual victories. The equivalent of big hats, missile parades, and mirrored sunglasses. In short, finding the decisive point is not something that an ego can easily do.
Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the All of Christ for All of Life podcast. That was the opening sections of Douglas Wilson's Rules for Reformers. If you'd like to hear the rest of the book on audio, you can purchase it at audible.com or anywhere audiobooks are sold.